Okay, well, I think we'll get started. It's noon, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Kettleson. I'm Community Development Specialist with the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission in Appleton. Welcome to our 8th Employer Lunch and Learn, where we share examples and resources aimed at helping our region's employers address workforce issues. For those of you unfamiliar with the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission, um, we provide a variety of services, including planning, grant writing, community and economic development, and regional marketing services to our 5-county region, which includes Big Stone, Chippewa, Lac-Parle, Swift, and Yellow Medicine, as well as the cities, townships, school districts, and Upper Sioux community. So if you'd like, I'd encourage you to visit our website. It's umvrdc.org. And also encourage you to follow us on Facebook to get updates on all the projects that we're doing. Well, we are back after a few months hiatus as we were planning our Southwest Minnesota Regional Workforce Summit that we held at the end of April in Taunton. And back at it, and our presenter today, Ray, had reached out to us about presenting there, but unfortunately our agenda had been filled, and I thought, well, this may be a good way to reach employers as well. So happy to have him join us today. Ray is the program coordinator of Minnesota DEED's Employer Reasonable Accommodation Fund, or ERAF. It's a central fund where small and mid-sized Minnesota employers can request reimbursement for expenses related to providing reasonable accommodations for job applicants and employees with disabilities. So I will get things started. We'll plan to have some time at the end for some question and answers, but if you have a question as Ray's presenting, please just feel free to enter them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, I'll turn things over to Ray.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And just double checking, are we recording? I wasn't sure on my end.
Yep, looks like it's going.
Okay. All right, sounds good. So let me go ahead and share my screen here and go and get started. So yeah, thank you for having me, Kevin, and thank you guys and gals for attending. As stated, my name is Ray McCoy. I'm the program coordinator for the Employer Reasonable Accommodation Fund. And, just to give you a little bit of an overview of what my role entails, is primarily marketing and outreach to inform employers and partners of this great program. It's a newer initiative here, in Minnesota that we've been doing for almost 2 years, and it's actually a one-of-a-kind initiative, as you will see, that's, unique to where no other state in the country is doing this as of right now, but for us. But more on that later. But in addition to my outreach and marketing role, I also provide technical assistance in helping employers implement those reasonable accommodations and leverage assistive technologies to include, to help them create the inclusive workplaces that they strive to create. And finally, I manage the processes and outcomes. So to ensure that the program is fulfilling its mission of, as you'll see, reducing financial barriers and fostering, workplace inclusive workplace environments here. So with that, let's kind of dive in, and I'll give you, let's start with the overview or in the history of ERAF, how it came to be. So one thing that we recognized, and that was needed all over the state, was that, employers wanted to give people opportunities that they might not have been able to get before. But what comes with that is, could be a financial, strain. I mean, reasonable accommodations, while a lot of them don't cost a lot, sometimes they can be pretty pricey. But even though for a small to mid-sized business, it could create, an undue hardship. And one of the things that the ADA states is that if, a business, purchasing a reasonable accommodation creates that undue hardship, then they are not obligated to do so. And that's where we stepped in. We wanted to, here at the state, create a program that addresses those barriers by helping businesses offset those costs for reasonable accommodations, and thus helping, to get people with disabilities in jobs so that they could be productive and, grow and have a long-term stable career. And thus for employers, helping, employers get a longer, return or bigger return on their investment, which usually comes from employment longevity. So that's how ERAF was born. As I stated, this timely initiative allows, small to mid-sized businesses to submit for reimbursements beginning that they made, going back to July 1st of 2023. This was an initial pilot program that the pilot is set to expire next month. However, we still got quite a bit of money and we can actually continue on with the program until all the money's spent. We have about $2.2 million left. So even after June 30th, we're still, able to service businesses, right? And so how this pilot, phase worked is like for each state fiscal year, the legislature appropriated $2 million. And out of that, 400,000 was earmarked to cover administrative expenses associated with running this program. And thus that funding, ensures that a substantial portion of the budget directly supports the accommodations that facilitate more inclusive work environments. So through ERAF, as I stated many times, and I will again in one way or another, the state aims to reduce economic challenges to accessibility by encouraging small to mid-sized businesses to hire and retain talented individuals with disabilities, and thereby foster a diverse workforce, right? And so, one last thing I want to note here is that when the legislature was determining, it put this together and it determined which agency would be best suited to administer this program, we here at State Services for the Blind, which is why it's housed under that, raised our hand and we said, yep, we'll go ahead and do it, even though I will make a note that we are a deed program, but State Services for the Blind was one of the entities within the state of Minnesota that was, instrumental in putting the program together. So that's why it's there. And I'll kind of go more into how the ERAF program works, right? And what it so does. So I can, talk about all these great things, but, how it works is, it's where an employer has an applicant or an employee with a disability, and they purchase necessary accommodations for the applicant to get through the application process, the hiring process, or the work environment, which I'll talk more about here in a little bit. So what happens is that, after they purchase this, they can apply for reimbursement through our program, and they are in every small to mid-sized business is entitled to up to $30,000 in reimbursement per fiscal year, right? So if a business spends $30,000 between now and the end of June, guess what? They can make more purchases for reasonable accommodations in July and be entitled to another $30,000 then, because that amount resets every year, right? This program not only ensures the employees with disabilities have the tools and resources they need to succeed, but also helps employers foster a more inclusive and productive and supportive workplace environment. So it's a win-win, as stated here, right? We want to make sure that this process is simplified. As you'll see here, there's not a lot of red tape. There's not a lot of, all the things that you might expect with a government program. And because we understand as small to mid-sized employers, you have other things to do. So we try to make this process as easy and as simple as we can. And, for you guys, it's another added benefit to, the benefits packages that you have. All right. So, as I stated, we try to keep things very simple. We don't have red tape and all that other fun stuff. So there's only 3 requirements that, make an employer eligible. Obviously, they have to be domiciled here in Minnesota, right? They have to have, they cannot have more than 500 employees, and they cannot generate any more than 5 million in gross annual revenue. Right. And so, this criteria ensures that ERAF is accessible to the wide range of businesses around the state, and making sure that, they are able to tap into this. Right. So the $1 million question I get a lot, and, can't stress enough, this is the main thing. What kinds of accommodations would be ones that ERAF would reimburse, right? And while we have a good list of examples here, what it comes down to is that do those reasonable accommodations and the nature of the situation align with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Which means that, the reasonable accommodation must be a workplace reasonable accommodation, and really talks about any sort of modification to the application or hiring process, the job, the way the job is done, or the work environment that enables a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job, right? There's one exception to that, though. Sometimes, as you know, restructuring a job duties and a job description is a reasonable accommodation. However, with that being said, it might come with having to pay that particular employee less. We've had a couple of instances where employers have called us saying, hey, if I have to restructure this job for this particular employee, I have to pay them less, but I don't want to do that, which is noble. Would ERAF reimburse that difference? And unfortunately, we cannot when it comes to things like profit and loss due to job restructuring. So that's the only, one that we're limited to. But other than that, we can do so. So as you see here, in addition to installing ramps or other physical modifications, which could be, altering restrooms to ensure that they're accessible for wheelchair users, primarily wheelchair employees in this case, to get the reimbursement, or adapting elevators for employees with mobility issues so that they can, get throughout the building. There's now advancements in assistive technology. I mean, nothing new probably to you guys. Like, now you can incorporate AI tools as part of reasonable accommodations. And there's a few examples, so, one of them would be things like using, AI personal assistants. We all know about Chat GPT, Claude, or Gemini, which can assist in things like, helping you draft emails or other reports or written materials. For somebody who may have dyslexia, or like myself, I use Chat GPT, and for somebody who's neurodivergent and has ADHD, that's been huge for me, right? But also, when you look at things like adjustable workstations, there's the traditional ergonomic workstations, and now they're ones that are controlled by AI. Some might call it scary, some might call it, oh, wow, that's an advancement in technology. And how that works is that these would automatically adjust to meet the user's ergonomic needs, enhancing their comfort and support for employees with physical disabilities. So quite a few options here. And that's one thing that we're gonna, talk about, but we're here to help you, and ensure that you have the right kinds of accommodations needed to move forward, right? So, as I mentioned in the beginning, an employer can receive up to $30,000 in reimbursements per fiscal year total, and this encompasses both one-time and ongoing reasonable accommodation expenses, right? So, for one-time accommodation expenses, notice a business cannot, spend it has to be at least $250, and this could be one one-time accommodation, or a combination of two. However, on the other side, the most that we could reimburse per each one-time reasonable accommodation is $15,000. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say I hire an employee who's in a wheelchair and needs access to my place of business. And as a result, I install 2 wheelchair ramps, one in the front and one in the emergency exit. The first ramp's going to cost me $17,000, while that second ramp's going to cost me $12,000. So here's how the program would work. For that first ramp, I would be reimbursed at that $15,000. Because remember, I can't get any more than that. But for that second ramp, I would get the full $12,000 back, right? Leaving me with $3,000 remaining between now and the end of the fiscal year that I could claim on reimbursement for other accommodations for either this employee or any other employees or applicants with disabilities, right? On the flip side, though, ongoing accommodations have no minimum or maximum spending requirements. So, just one thing to keep in common, that once you hit that 30,000, there is no, obviously we would have to wait till the next fiscal year. But so also looking at that, chat GPT costs like about what, $25 a month and whatnot, and other things of the like. They're not that expensive monthly, but one thing somebody could do is like, apply once they've made that first installment, get reimbursed, and then send other, proofs of payment in subsequently until they hit that 30,000. All right. But another example is, you can also do something like, sometimes subscriptions come in like, increments of 3 months, 6 months, a year. So going back to the example that I previously stated, in addition to, let's say that this employee, in addition to needing a wheelchair, also needs a sign language interpreter. And let's say for the next couple of months, that's going to cost me $4,500. So I would have to submit another, application to the ERAF program, noting that, yep, I spent $4,500, but I want to only get back that 3,000 because that's all I have left over, right? But once July rolls around, July 1st, I would be eligible for another 30,000, in which I can continue, for any subsequent payments on my ongoing reasonable accommodations beginning July or moving forward, or any new one-time reasonable accommodation expenses. I would be able to start claiming reimbursement on that until I hit 30 next year, right? So let's kind of talk a little bit more about, or a little bit about, the pre-application process. And this just gives you an idea of what steps usually employers take, prior to filling out the application. And we say that, this is pretty important because, we want to make sure that once they submit the application, that we get them through and get their money to them, as quickly as possible, and it's a smooth process. So for the first step, disclosure and internal processing, a lot of times, in, whether it's formal or informal, and this is something also we don't get involved in, an employee or applicant may disclose their disability to their manager or HR department, expressing a need for accommodations. Again, like I said, we do not require employers to disclose any specifics. So no, specifically no documentation that shows their disability from doctor's notes or anything, or no proof of employment. We don't even need the employee's name, right? We would just need, on the application, which I'm jumping ahead a little bit, just a description of, like a brief description of, yep, I have this disability. This is why I need this accommodation. Boom. We're good. But a lot of times, and I've been through this myself, where, I had to do the internal, processing, where they ask, okay, well, what kinds of accommodations do you need? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I know I need something, but I'm not sure what. And that's where step 2 comes into play, the consultation. And this is probably the most crucial of it all. So, if an employer is uncertain about what kinds of accommodations are needed, or, whether a specific accommodation cost is eligible, for reimbursement under the ERAF program, they can hit us up for a free consultation, and we will discuss, different types of potential accommodations that would be an effective, or appropriate for the employer applicant, and this is a good time for you guys as employers, if you had any ideas about specific items or services that you might want to purchase as a reasonable accommodation, to check with us, because we want to make sure that we'll let you know on the front end, yes, this is something that could be reimbursable, or nope, we can't do that. And we want to make sure that, you're not blindsided with the denial after you came out your pocket, So after all that, like I said, an employer could do this as many times as they want, no additional charge whatsoever, because we believe in, making sure that employers, are, basically setting themselves up for success. But after how many times they decide to do this, they go ahead and purchase the accommodation, and then that's when they would fill out that application, which will be on our website, right? And I'll share that stuff with you near the end. So when they submit it, the only thing we need at the time of application would be proof of purchase. And as long as that proof has 4 touch points, date of purchase, the amount spent, the description of the item, and proof that it's actually been paid. Like, if it shows, yep, it's been transacted through, this particular means, then we're fine, right? So once it's submitted, Usually I take about, at most 5 days to review it. I'll reach out if I have any additional questions. And if I don't and it's approved, then our financial technician will reach out to the employer to complete, the next steps and get them set up. As you can see here, they have to fill out a substitute W-9 form and would be asked to, register within Swift as a vendor if they haven't done so already. And they will walk them through the entire process. But once everything is set up, an employer can expect this reimbursement to be back in their bank account within 30 days. And this is because, going back to our mission, we want to help employers overcome any sort of real or perceived financial barriers. And we also want them to avoid undue hardships with these accommodations. And that's why, we stress on, making sure that they have that money back in their account as soon as possible, right? So, again, another way we're different from most government programs in that regards. All right. So while ERAF provides, critical support for employers, making reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities, some things that, that they could do, there are unfortunately specific instances where we have to deny reimbursement requests. And while I won't repeat these verbatim, I'll just give you some examples of these. So, expenses that are not qualifying, under the ADA, could be something like we actually had a employer who purchased a vehicle for an employee, with a disability to help them get to and from work, which I'm like, hey, more power to you. That's awesome. However, being that general transportation costs commuting to and from work does not qualify, we had to deny that. But, one thing that we noted, let's say that it was assuming a mobility issue where either, they couldn't drive on their own or, needed, or in this case, may have needed like a wheelchair or something, or use a wheelchair and can't fully drive. One thing they could have done was, like, with this company car, they could have made it accessible for the person in a wheelchair to access the car, and install hand steering devices for the sole purpose that they would use it as a way to, if they were doing like during work transportation, if they had to make shipments to places or go transport between work sites, that stuff we would be able to reimburse, right? Another one, as you see here, it has to be for the applicant or employee with a disability, and sometimes there's a gray area there. Another example that we've had early on is that we encountered businesses that have made general upgrades for ADA compliance without a specific request from an employee or applicant, right? And while these preemptive modifications are beneficial, unfortunately, we would not be able to, and we told them we're not able to reimburse this because they were not tied to an applicant or employee with a disability, which they said there was none. They were doing it to try to get some in the door. Unfortunately, we can't do that. All right. The last one, is, can be common, and it's not something, it's a little bit misleading, so I want to explain this. When it comes to things like missing or insufficient documentation for proof of purchase, right? So, let's say that an employer, and I don't, encourage you guys to do this. Sometimes they can submit the application, they won't have the proofs of purchase. Well, obviously we can't do anything until we have those proofs, right? So usually you get an email from me if I need any additional documentation as soon as your application is submitted. And what we'll do, though, is that we hold those applications for up to 2 months, right? I'll send you notifications saying, hey, we need this and this in order to continue. And in the end, after 2 months, 3, reach outs and a call. If we can't get it, then we would have to close the application, but that doesn't stop you from doing another one in the future, right? So, with that being said, another one being like insufficient documentation, going back to that that second slide where, we talked about the timeline where, like, a purchase has to be made after July 1st of 2023. Let's say that, we've actually had a couple of people early on who have made purchases for reasonable accommodations, but unfortunately, those purchases happened prior to July 1st of 2023. And actually one sad story is like, man, they purchased it a week before July 1st of 2023. And I'm like, man, had you waited just 1 week, we would have been able to do so, right? But, again, they could apply in the future if they have, other post-dated, purchases, and we're good to go. In fact, this is also another thing that's great about the program. Let's say that you as a business, you had, or, still have being spent reasonable accommodations on, for an employer applicant with a disability going back to August of 2023. You could still apply for ERAF funding today, and anything that you spent, between now and then, we would be able to reimburse, which would go through, which would go against obviously the $30,000 amount, for this particular fiscal year alone. So, you wouldn't be entitled to getting an additional 30 from, the first year, but, anything that you spent between July 1st and now would be eligible for, reimbursement, and would be deducted from the 30,000 from this, particular fiscal year, and go on, so on and so forth, right? So that's also a great thing to do. But, with that being said, regardless of why an employer is denied, they have the right to appeal. And that appeal, must happen within 30 days of receiving the denial letter. And this allows you guys to present any other information or clarify any sort of misunderstandings that might have influenced our initial decision. Because we want to make sure that we're helping as many people as we can, right? Being that this is a new program, blah, 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 I could go on and on. It's one thing, like, its success is vital to, show that, hey, we could be a national model here, right? So, moving forward to streamline the process, we technically, during application, we would require just the receipts, the proofs of purchase for the reasonable accommodations. On the back end, if it's a newer business that we have, that's been in business for a little while, and that's obviously the first time using us, we would need proof of, the revenue stream, like the revenue, which could be in the form of a, last year's tax returns or revenue records. We just need to see that you are under that 5 million, right? But, other than that, it's good to go. With that being said, though, we do quarterly audits, which is another thing that we want to make sure that we have a tight system in place. And any employee, although this has not happened yet, that fails to meet the requirements may have to return some, if not all of the funds that they've received. Again, that has not happened yet, because in addition to, asking an employer for the documentation, proving what their revenue is, there's a spot on the application that certifies that the employer does meet that small to mid-sized business standard, right? Which is an official certification, So outside of that, though, we're compatible with other kinds of programs. So yesterday I was actually at an event for, service providers for people with disabilities. And a lot of talk came up regarding, like, the caddy waivers program, which helps, employees get complimentary job coaching, right? So, one thing that's great about being compatible with this is that, let's say that, someone's waiver expires, but they still need job coaching, then they can, pay for that and get reimbursed through ERAF. Or if, which is the more common way, even if there's certain accommodations that the waiver does not pay for, well, they can utilize ERAF funds, while using that waiver. So that's also unique. And another thing is, like, let's say that you have a loan that you needed to get to purchase, some sort of, like, reasonable accommodation. You can do that. You don't have to wait to pay off the loan. Just show that you made one payment, and you could still get reimbursed because it's been paid for. And technically, that full reimbursement would go toward, you can apply it towards your loan and pay it off, right? Now, I don't know, what their standards are or whatnot. I know that at times there's prepayment penalties, which I won't go into the weeds about, but yeah, we allow you to do that as part of this program. So, another way that's unique. So before we, kind of keep going on, I want to get into more of the, core of how and why the technical assistance and consultation part is important, right? So as I said, that's something that we offer, with no cost to employers, and they could do this as many times as they want, because we want to ensure that employers understand and can effectively implement reasonable accommodations by following all sort of, the ADA compliance laws, as well as, here in the state of Minnesota, DLI, they have their own accessibility compliance laws that businesses have to, adhere to. So as you can see here, different things that we might do is like if they wanted to learn more about what their rights are in terms of retaining individuals with disabilities, or what the rights of the employees are, that's something that we could talk about, and usually I'll pull in an ADA coordinator there. Another thing could be, when it comes to things like ramps, bathrooms, or elevators, I want to make sure that what the ADA compliance piece is, because, especially with bathrooms, it could be something like sinks have to be a certain height, toilet stalls have to be a certain width, and whatnot. And we want to make sure that, those things are adhered to so that they meet the compliance, which you'll get usually after the consultation. But in addition to that, we also want to link, employers to different sorts of disability related trainings, if they want to further enhance their understanding and capabilities and how they could become an inclusive leader in employment within the state of Minnesota, right? So, outside of that too, there's also, room like, for asking questions. Being that we're a new program, some big questions have come out of this, which have, changed the game. And this is a great place to do it. I mean, this is a great place to do it too, right here. But, this is something that, we want to offer as, a major benefit. Again, like I said, you do this as many times as you want so that employers will be able to, know what they got to do to, be successful. Right. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done and the impact that it's made, this far. As you can see here, these testimonials highlight, how the ERAF program has empowered, Minnesota businesses and to create productive and inclusive workplaces. So employers like the Aiken County Developmental Achievement Center have improved employee comfort and productivity through specialized accommodations, while organizations like the Lansboro Chamber of Commerce have benefited from financial support, of the ERAF program to meet their employees' needs without any sort of added strain, right? So, these stories like that are ones that show how we remove financial barriers that enable businesses to focus on fostering stronger and more inclusive teams and achieve greater success, which is what we all want to do, right? And so this story is my favorite. I can't, share this enough. So this is Ellie, and she's actually a dedicated employee at, the Dunn Brothers Coffee Shop here in Hopkins, Minnesota, and one of three that are owned by the franchisor, whose name is Michael Kohler. So, thanks to ERAF, Michael was able to purchase, a specialized espresso machines that made tasks more accessible for, Ellie, and also ensured her safety. So for Ellie, this job, isn't just about making coffee, it's also about gaining independence, building confidence, and being a part of a supportive team. So, in the end, Michael didn't just create jobs, he also created opportunities for inclusion. With ERAF support, he expanded his hiring practices and has welcomed other employees with disabilities since doing this, thus demonstrating that the right tools and mindset, with the right tools and mindset, businesses can thrive by embracing inclusivity. One thing that he said was how the community has really stepped up and supported this, providing how impactful these efforts can be with both businesses and the people they served. And that's what we're all about: removing barriers, fostering talent, and empowering businesses to make a difference. So imagine what your business could achieve by opening its doors to new possibilities like this, right? Just to kind of wet your tongue a little bit. So, going back, let's talk more about, how this can directly benefit you as an employer. Well, first and foremost, it's obvious. You get $30,000 in reimbursements to cover cost of workplace reasonable accommodations, which would help you provide, the support needed to ensure employees with disabilities can perform at their best. And as you know, when someone gets that support, they're more likely to stay longer. And studies have shown, kind of jumping a little bit ahead here, that people with disabilities tend to stay longer at jobs than people without disabilities, right? So within this, you're creating an accessible, and supportive environment where you'll support employee retention, morale, and productivity. Because as I said before, those who feel supported with or without a disability are more likely to stay longer, long term at a job and contribute more effectively, right? And that's one thing that we're doing. We're trying to help you build a more diverse and inclusive team while positioning your company as a leader in inclusive employment here in Minnesota, right? So another thing too that you want to consider is that investing in this, inclusivity has a measurable return on their investment. As I said, people with disabilities tend to stay at jobs longer than people without. So, as you are providing those reasonable accommodations, you're ensuring that that employee would be successful long term. And thus, like any business wants to do, you want to get a bigger return on your investment, right? So, all those benefits and more come with, being part of the ERAF program, right? And so going back to like the training, this is actually a new partner training that is offered by our vocational rehabilitation services that, in conjunction with us, is designed to help Minnesota employers create more inclusive workplaces and foster a supportive culture for employees with disabilities. So within this training, you'll focus on things like, how to diversify your workforce and unlock the potential for qualified individuals with disabilities to, ultimately succeed. Right. And so, if you want to learn more about this, here's the link here below. Like I said, I'll make sure that the slideshow is sent to you. And with that being said, I definitely want to open this up for questions. I know you're a little tired of hearing me talk, and I want to hear from some of you guys. So, yeah, either mute your mic or whatnot. Let's have them.
I had a question. We have someone, and we're in a manufacturing environment, and we have someone who is possibly needing an accommodation, but I think that we're kind of struggling with ideas on how to ensure safety while having accommodations. Is this something that could help with ideas like that?
Yep. So remember, we offer that consultation. So, during that consultation, these are things that we could help, take a look at. So if you want to, you know, my next slide, I'll have my contact information. Reach out to me and let's set up a consultation and talk about, the situation and see what we can come up with.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else?
I have a question. We have branches, we're in banking, and we have branches in both Minnesota and in Montana. Would this apply for only the employees in Minnesota, or what would that look like for us?
So it's a Minnesota-based thing. So so when it comes to that, it has to be strictly domiciled in Minnesota. And I take it with the bank, are all the branches connected then?
They are.
Yep. So something like that, unfortunately, would not qualify.
Okay.
One thing I didn't mention before, which I'll mention now, is that, if it was something like a franchise, if the franchise falls under that particular guideline where, like, say if it's like a McDonald's or something that I own, here in Minnesota, obviously I'm making a lot less than 5 million and have a lot less than 500 employees, that's something that would qualify because I'm not connected to the corporation. But yeah, fortunately something like, within the bank, would not. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else?
I had a question. Maybe I thought it was, this is a great program. I like the part that it's simple and not as cumbersome maybe as some state and federal programs that people deal with, especially myself. We deal with them a lot, and that's usually a major complaint. So that's refreshing to hear. I was just wondering, when they submit their application and maybe have a project, let's say it's the ramp again. How do you ensure that the ramp is built to ADA standards? Is there some sort of inspection, or is it just kind of
So
honor system, or I guess how does that work?
it would be like that honor system here. One thing is that there's only 3 of us. So we
Sure.
definitely, like, if it's someplace out there in Western Minnesota, we definitely can't go out to the business and, look at that. All we can do is just, like, supply them with the, here are the standards, here, set by the ADA in the state. And, they would go and find, a builder to do so, and then off they go. Sometimes what employers have done in the past, though, is that they have sent to us sketches of things, which we like, obviously. They're like, hey, this is how it's going to be built. As you can see, it's like it adheres to standards, but that's not something we necessarily require.
And kind of along the same lines, are they required to have a certain number of estimates or bids or anything prior to doing?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. Any
Hey,
other
this
questions?
is, yeah, this is
Yeah.
Paula, and I'm from the same bank as Christy. So our bank is actually headquartered in Minnesota, and we have multiple branches in Minnesota and Montana. Would the Minnesota banks qualify?
Are they all?
Since our the headquarters is in Clara City, Minnesota.
Yep. So are they all connected though? Because, like, let's say that all the branches are connected as one bank, right? Where,
Okay, yes, I just wanted to clarify that.
yeah,
Okay,
because, when it's connected like that, we'd have to count all employees and obviously all the revenue that the bank generates, as
gotcha.
opposed to if it's a franchise.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Good questions, by the way. Nope. Well, that kind of takes me to our last slide here. Like, if you have any other questions or are seeking assistance, and want to, get more information about ERAF, like I said, I'll make sure that I get this slideshow to Kevin so that he gets it to you guys. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email. Let's get, let's get some set up. I know that, and see what kind of ways that we could work together. But yeah, as I stated, ERAF represents that significant step forward in our commitment to fostering inclusive workplaces for all Minnesotans. And thus, we want to make sure that we're providing that financial assistance and resources for reasonable accommodations and whatnot, where it's not only complying to the ADA, but also enhancing, as I said, productivity, workplace morale, and, a good corporate culture across the state. So, thank you very much for having me today. And like I said, look forward to connecting with all of you guys here down the line. So thank you very much, Kevin.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ray. Appreciate the information on the program. And like you said, we will send out Ray's slides and contact information to everyone here with maybe a short survey too. And, if you have any ideas for future webinars coming up, please let us know. But otherwise, that concludes our webinar for today. Again, thanks everyone for joining us, and stay dry out there. It's kind of another dreary, rainy day. So hopefully we get some warmth. Thanks everyone. We'll see you.
Thank you.